You saw that, right? He was trying to take the clicker from me. Good morning. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers that we have that are here with us. Always glad to have visitors with us as well. And we enjoy your company. We enjoy having you come and spend time worshiping the Lord with us, even when you're on vacation. And so it's great inspiration to us to have you here. You know, a lot of times when we talk about roles in the church, maybe on Mother's Day, we'll talk about women are to be submissive and that's their role, and that they're not to usurp the authority of man. They're not to teach. They're not to be the ones to preach or to lead prayers, and that's certainly true. And a lot of times we talk about roles. On Father's Day we talk about men, taking up that role of leadership in the church and their responsibilities and their love being sacrificial for their wives. And it's important that we understand those things. I used to have the students at the school write a paper on women's role, and they were instructed, because of the scope of the paper and not wanting the paper to be 1,000 pages long, that they were to just focus on those things that were controversial, if you will, the restrictions that women have. And certainly we see those things, but women play a very important role in the church, and that role is not one that is to be minimized. Role is not one that's to be swept under the rug. Women play an important role within the church, and it's a role that should never be ignored. Women in the church are very important, and in my experience in the church, I've been a Christian for some almost 30 years now. I've seen more faithful women in the church than men, by and large. A lot of times it's widows, or it's women who are bringing their children with them. And so those moms, those women, they're important to the church. They serve an important role. We know that older women are to teach the younger women. Notice with me over in Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. When he starts talking about the women, he says, the older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, right? That they have the right kind of behavior, not slanderers or not malicious gossips, I think some translations may have there. Not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. And so there's a role that's given there for women, that the women are to lead. And sometimes that doesn't happen just in word, but it happens in deed. It happens in action. It happens in the things that they do and the way that they carry themselves, that the older women can be a guiding light, if you will, to the younger women, to teach them these things. And that's important. It's important that they lead not just by their words, but by their examples. And when we think about women leading by example, there's perhaps no better example of this than when we look at the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. If you turn with me to Ruth chapter 1, we're going to notice a mother there that was influential in her actions in leading Ruth, leading others to find the Lord. And so we're going to spend our time in Ruth chapter 1. And when we look at this text, when we look at this group of passages from verse 1 through verse 18, I want us to notice that there are three questions that are suggested by the text as to what's going on here in this particular narrative. And the first question that we might be able to gather from the text, the first question that maybe the text suggests to us is, how did we end up here? How did we end up here? You ever wonder about how you ended up where it is that you are? Sometimes people will want to look back in their past, and they'll want to look back at their heritage. And in times past, I've got on to ancestry.com and done some research there to see some things. And I find that if I follow my dad's family and I go through my grandmother, I can trace my grandmother's family, one part of that family, all the way back to the 1620s. Shortly after the Pilgrims arrived. In the late 1620s, one of her ancestors arrived and became a servant of Miles Standish, if you've ever heard of Miles Standish. And so my grandmother's family goes back. And so I can trace them back a long way. Well, if I go through my grandfather, I don't get very far. If I go through my grandfather, I get to my great-grandfather, and that's all the further I can go. He came over from Czechoslovakia in between World War I and World War II. He had fought on the side of Austro-Hungarian Empire. He had fought on that side in World War I, had been captured as a prisoner of war by the Russians, and got out of that and decided he was going to leave Europe, and he came to the United States, and he came with his wife, and he came with his oldest son, and they settled. They landed in Pennsylvania for a short time, and then they ended up in northern Ohio. Now, how they ended up in northern Ohio, I don't know. Maybe it was work. Maybe it was because that's where the jobs were. There was a lot of manufacturing that was there in northern Ohio, and so they ended up in northern Ohio. And you wonder how, why they got there or how they got there. I remember when I was working in Cleveland and I lived 38 miles to the west, and I'm driving 38 miles and the snow's blowing and I'm doing about 20 miles an hour, and I got the white knuckles on the steering wheel, and it's going to take me about 2 or 2.5 hours to get home. And I remember thinking to myself, why does anybody live here? I get a big amen from Jacob. We wonder sometimes how we ended up here. Well, Naomi and her family, they end up in Moab. Notice with me here in the text, in the first 5 verses, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab, and they remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took 2 wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband." It tells us here that they are living during the time period of the Judges, and there's a famine in the land. And it could be that this lines up in the book of Judges with Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6 tells us about Gideon, but Gideon and the people of that time, they were being oppressed by the Midianites. And the Midianites had this habit of waiting until harvest time would come. And when harvest time would come, the Midianites would come in and they'd beat up the children of Israel, and they'd basically take their lunch money, right? They'd take the harvest. And so we find Gideon there in Judges chapter 6, and he's down in a wine press, right? He's trying to hide himself, and he's threshing out the wheat so that they'll have something to eat, so the Midianites won't come and take this from them. And so it could be that that's the case, that that's what's going on, and it's God's punishment for them that this is happening. Right? This idea of this famine or these things that are going on in the land, they're being oppressed because they were supposed to remove all these people from the land. That was their job. When they came into the land of Canaan, they were to drive all of the inhabitants out. And when they don't drive all the inhabitants out, they start learning about their idolatry, and they start practicing their idolatry. And when they practice idolatry, God oppresses them by using one of these groups. And in this case, he's using the Midianites to oppress them because of their idolatry. And so God's punishment is taking place here. And so there's a famine that is in the land. And so when there's a famine in the land, what do? Well, you go where the food is. Right. And so they leave the area of the promised land. They leave the area of their inheritance, and they go over to the land of Moab. And so they end up in Moab. And because they get in there, they get themselves settled in, they get comfortable being there. And the sons even took wives, women that were there. There were Moabites. They took those women to be their wives. And so they're not just there temporarily, if you will, that they are basically settled in, that they have taken wives from that area and they are there. Now, Moab, when we look at its history, where did Moab come from? Well, the Moabites came from Lot, basically. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember Lot and his daughters, they exit the area. They're led by the angels, and they get out of there, and Lot's wife turns around, and she looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. But Lot and his daughters are in a cave, and they likely think that they're the only ones that are left in humanity. They think that, well, nobody else is left. Everyone else has perished. And in Genesis chapter 19, verses 36 and 37, they end up getting Lot drunk, and they sleep with him to perpetuate the race, right, to continue the human race. They figure this is what they have to do. And it says in verse 36, "Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day." And so that's where they came from. That's their history. Now they're on the other side of the Jordan River. That's where their settlement was. And over there, they practice idolatry. And so it's not that Naomi and her family, it's not that they're escaping idolatry by coming to Moab, because there's idolatry that takes place in Moab. Baal and Chemosh were their two primary gods that were over there. They had many others, but there's all this idolatry that still exists around Israel because they didn't get rid of these groups that they were supposed to get rid of. And so while they're here in Moab, a disaster strikes. Naomi's husband Elimelech, he passes away, and she still has her two sons, but eventually her two sons also pass away, and now the women are left. It's Naomi and her two daughters-in-law that are left. And in this day and age, you couldn't just go down to Walmart and get a job as a greeter, right, in order to sustain your family. You couldn't go work at Dollywood or other places, right? They didn't have those things. There was no Social Security. There's nothing for them to fall back on. If they didn't have a father or a brother or a husband or a son to take care of them, women were in a precarious position. Not the case so much in our day and age, but they were left alone and they had no one to care for them. And the tendency in those types of situations, when these things happen, their tendency was to wonder about, well, is this part of God's punishment? Is God punishing us for something? Is there some sort of sin that we've committed? Is there something that we've done that God is punishing us? And I sometimes wonder, well, why doesn't Satan ever get his share of the credit? Right? Why doesn't Satan ever get his share of the blame when bad things happen to us? But Naomi feels as if she's been stricken by God, if you will. At the end of verse 13, she says, "No, my daughters, it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." She feels that this is the Lord's doing, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against her, that she is being treated this way by God, that she's grieved in the loss of her husband and the loss of her two sons. And that's a common idea that God's punishing you when something bad happens. When you look at the book of Job, Job's friends certainly had that attitude. Job suffers all these great things. His friends show up, and it says in the book of Job that for the first 7 days, Job's friends, they just sit there and they say nothing. That was the best thing those friends did in that whole time that they were with Job, is those 7 days that they sat there with their mouth shut, didn't say anything. They were just there for him. Because when they opened up their mouths, they said, "Job, you must have done something really bad that God's punishing you this way. You must have really messed up that God's doing this to you. And you need to just come clean. You just need to admit what it is that you've done, that God is punishing." And that was the common mindset. It was even the common mindset when you get to the time of Jesus in the first century. Because remember, Jesus and the disciples, as they're coming around, they encounter a blind man. He's blind since birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The disciples want to know, who are you punishing because this man is born blind? And Jesus says, no, it's not this man's sin. It's not his parents' sin. It's not because of anyone's sin that he was born blind. Just a circumstance, if you will, of living in this world. Things happen in this world. Sometimes time and chance happen to all of us. But there are things that happen in this world. And we certainly know in the case of Job that it was Satan that was bringing all of this about. And so, like I said, he never gets enough credit. But that's where they are. And how did they end up there? Well, they ended up there because of the famine. And so we see this question maybe suggested by the text. How did we end up here? The next question we notice from the text is, well, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Notice with me, it says, "And she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah." So Naomi is homesick. She's been here in Moab. She's been here for at least 10 years, but she's been here for a period of time, and she's homesick. And word gets to them that the famine has passed. Now, if we're looking at Judges chapter 6, that particular famine lasted for about 7 years. And so, they don't have Fox News that they can tune into and see immediately when these things had taken place. But word gets to them over in Moab that the Lord had visited his people and that the famine was over, that the Lord had visited his people and gave them bread, gave them food, that they are The famine is over there. And so when it says there that God visited his people, it doesn't mean that God stopped by and said hello. Right? He didn't just say, hey, how are things going? When it says that God visited his people, he visited them in their affliction. He visited them by taking care of what it was that their needs were. He took care of them by ending the famine. And so now he's visited them and they have bread. It's similar to how we are told in James chapter 1 in verse 27 that we are to visit others. Notice James there says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. We are to visit them in their trouble. We are to visit them in their affliction, if you will. And so when we visit widows and orphans, it's not just to visit them to say, hey, I hope everything's going okay. Be warm and filled, which basically means you warm yourself and you feed yourself. And you're saying that to somebody that doesn't have the ability to warm themselves and to feed themselves. I wish you well. That doesn't do anything for them. That doesn't help them at all, right? If we're going to visit them in their time of need, if we're going to visit them in their affliction, if we're going to visit them like God visited children of Israel, then we're going to help take care of what their needs are. So if we visit a widow and we notice, hey, her leaves need to be raked, or the gutters need to be cleaned out, or there's some electrical issues that need to be fixed, we need to visit them and help take care of that. Maybe take care of some financial needs that they have as well. Widows in the church should never have to decide whether they're going to buy their medication or they're going to eat. That should never be the case. Right? Pure and undefiled religion is this, to visit the orphans and widows in their need and to take care of those things. And so the affliction is over. The affliction of the famine is over. God has visited his people. He's given them bread. Well, in the book of Judges, we see this pattern, right, that keeps working over and over again in the book of Judges. The people basically, things are good, and they get fat, and they get happy, and they get stupid, and they start practicing idolatry. They start doing things that the Lord doesn't want them to do. And so the Lord gives them oppression. He brings an oppressor upon them. And when he brings the oppressor upon them, well, now things aren't going well. Now we're having to be subservient to this other group. Now they're coming in and they're stealing our lunch money, or they're doing this, or they're taking our food. And they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. And when they cry out to the Lord for deliverance, when they are sincere about that, they put the idols away, they call out to God. God sends them a judge. The judge delivers them from the oppression that they're going through. And then things get better again, right? And while the judge is alive, things remain good. But once the judge dies, they get fat and they get happy and they get stupid again. And they go back down that road of idolatry, and then God raises up another oppressor. And this pattern goes over and over and over again through the book of Judges. And so here we are. They've been oppressed by this famine. The famine is over. Things are better. And Naomi is homesick, and she wants to go back to her home. She wants to go back to her people. And she has her daughters-in-law with her, but she's got no way of being able to take care of them. As a woman, as a widow, as having her husband pass away and having her sons pass away, she doesn't have any good prospects. And so she's going to beckon them to go back to their homes. She's going to beckon them to stay here in Moab. Notice with me in verse 8, it says, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And so here's Orpah and Ruth, and they want to follow Naomi. They want to go with her. They want to go with her to where she's going back to the promised land. They want to go with her back to Israel. And Naomi says, no, don't go with me. She says, I want you to go back home to the homes of your mothers. It's interesting to me that she says, go back home to the homes of your mothers. She doesn't say, go back home to dad. She says, go back home to mom. Well, why is that? Why is that? They're in a period of despair, if you will. They're in a period of depression. And you can see that in Naomi. You can see that Naomi is very grieved by what has happened. And so they've got this thing that's happened where their husbands have all passed away. Naomi's husband has passed away. Orpah's husband has passed away. Ruth's husband has passed away. And so they're all dealing with this grief of those that have gone on. And when you're dealing with grief, who is it that you're going to run to? You're going to run to mama, right? You're going to run to mom because mom's better at comforting than dad is, generally speaking. You know, when Junior's playing ball and he falls down and he skins his knee, he goes running to mama because he knows that mama's going to make a big fuss over that, right? She's going to make a big fuss over that skinned knee. She's going to put some medicine on that. She's going to get out, I don't know if it's Power Rangers or SpongeBob or Dora the Explorer, but she's going to get out the Band-Aids, right? She's going to put the Band-Aid on there. She's maybe going to kiss the boo-boo and make it better, right? And so they're going to run to mom because they're going to get all of this attention. What's dad going to do? That didn't hurt. It ain't that bad. Just rub some dirt on it. Get back in the game, right? So they're not going to get much sympathy from dad. So mom, so it seems natural that she's telling them, go back to your mother's house. Later, we find out that we might think, well, maybe the fathers have died, but we find out later in chapter 2, verse 11, it appears that Ruth's father is still alive because Boaz references that she left mother and father in order to come with Naomi. And so mothers are a better comfort in times of sorrow, generally speaking. And so she says, look, I don't have any other sons. I had these two sons and they both passed away. I don't have any prospects for you. And so Naomi's words are, she wants what's best for them, or what she thinks in the physical world is best for them, because she doesn't have any way of being able to financially take care of these two girls. She doesn't have any hope of having another husband because she's old. But she says, even if I had hope, even if I had another husband tonight, even if I conceived children tonight, are you going to wait the 20 years for them to come to fruition? Who's going to take care of you in that 20-year time span? And so she genuinely has what she thinks is best for them in her minds when she says, no, don't come with me. Go back to your mother's houses. Go back to your homes. Go back to your people. I don't have any prospects for you. And she has no way to take care of them. And so she believes that it's better for them to go back to their parents' households, go back to their mother's house, find another husband, and that husband will take care of you. As I said, women in this time period, they would have needed a father or a husband or a son to be able to take care of them, to be able to provide for them their physical needs, to be able to provide for them financially. The world, as I said, was a much different place then than it is today. But Naomi wants to go home. She wants to go back home. She wants to go back to her homeland. She wants to go back to her people. She wants to go back to that land that God had promised to the Israelites. She wants to go back to that promised land. She wants to go home. We should strive to want to follow in Naomi's footsteps and want to go home. This world is not our home. We're just passing through. Naomi's going back to that physical promised land, but God has a promised land that He has promised to us. We ought to have a desire to want to go home. We ought to be homesick for a home that we've never seen, but it's a home that we've heard about. And it's a home that we understand, even though we don't know what it's going to be like, that it's a home that's much better than anything that we've ever seen or that we've ever experienced here while we're on earth. We ought to have a desire to want to turn our feet and to walk in a way that's going to lead us home. Naomi does that. She points her feet in the direction of her home. We need to do the same thing. And so we see that, how did they end up here? Well, because of the famine. Where we go from here? Well, Naomi wants to go home. She wants to go to that promised land. And then the third question that the text suggests to us is, well, who are we bringing with us? Who are we bringing with us? Naomi is basically begging them to not come with her, to go back to their mother's homes. Notice we'll pick up here in verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Now, this is perhaps poor spiritual advice that Naomi's giving. Go back to your people, go back to your gods. But maybe it's a test of Ruth's faith. You're going to go back to where you're comfortable. You're going to go back to the thing that you know. She says, go back to your family. Return to your sister-in-law, after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." Ruth says, "I'm not going back. I'm going to follow after you." And even though Naomi can't offer her any physical hope, even though she can't offer her any financial help, right? She's got no sons, she's got no husband, she's got no means for financial assistance. But it's not that physical hope that Ruth is interested in. She's interested in something deeper. She's interested in something spiritual. And even though we see Naomi in this particular instance, maybe at the depth of her despair over the loss of her husband and over the loss of her two sons, Ruth sees something in Naomi that she's seen during that time period that they've been there in Moab. She's not influenced by what's going on with Naomi in this particular moment, in her worst moment, if you will, but she has seen something in Naomi that makes Naomi a mother to follow. She sees that spiritual hope. And because of that spiritual hope, Ruth, instead of going back to her people, it says that she clung to Naomi. She's holding on for everything that she has. And she says, "I'm not going back. I'm going with you. I'm going to go with you. Where you go, that's where I'm going to go, wherever that is, because there's spiritual hope in Israel. Where you lodge, where you live, that's where I'm going to live, because there's spiritual hope that's there. Your people," well, who is her people? Well, her people are God's people, right? They're the children of Israel. They're God's chosen. "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." I'm not going back to those idols. I've experienced a taste of what the real God is like. I've experienced a taste of what God really wants, who God really is. Through Naomi and her family, she's experienced that, and she doesn't want to turn away from that. And even though Naomi's spirit is hurting, her influence, her actions speak much louder than her words, because her words are saying, "Don't come with me. Don't follow me. Go back home to your gods." Even though that's what her words are saying, through her actions and through her influence, she's shown Ruth something so much better. And Ruth wants to be a part of that. And Ruth sees Naomi as a mother to follow. And so why does Ruth do this? Well, she must have seen something in Naomi. She must have seen a gentle and loving character that as a child of God that Naomi would have had. She must have seen the genuine care that she has. And we see the genuine care that she has for her daughters-in-law. We think about family relationships now. You know the difference between outlaws and in-laws? Outlaws are wanted. Sometimes the in-laws, we don't have a real good relationship with in-laws, but here, this is their mother-in-law, right? And they've got this relationship with their mother-in-law that she wants to go with her. She wants to follow after her. And so she sees that genuine care that she has, that Naomi has for her daughters-in-law. And it's stronger than the physical bond that she has with her own parents. She has that, right? So you would think, well, that physical bond, that's what's going to win out when push comes to shove. No, when push comes to shove, it's not that physical family that she has, but it's the spiritual family that she has that's more important to her. Many times people that are raised in the church, when you start thinking about your physical family and your church family, a lot of times that's the same folks. that you're talking about because your family's in the church. Sometimes your family isn't in the church. Sometimes you come to it from outside. Sometimes you come to it from a denominational group or something else, and your physical family isn't with you in that. But the bonds, the things that we share together as a spiritual family are so much heavier, so much weightier, so much more important than what it is that we share with our own physical families. And Ruth got that. Ruth understood that this bond that she has with Naomi as part of her spiritual family was more important than her own physical family. And so there are times in the church where we may have surrogate mothers, mothers that aren't by birth, but mothers that we end up choosing in the church, in our church family, that we have someone that maybe is a mother figure to us. I've had several in my time in the church. I've had several that I've considered to be surrogate mothers. Some of them have gone on to their reward, and I'm hoping to get to see them again someday. But that spiritual family ought to be important to us. It's more important than the physical bond that we share. And so she sees something in Naomi. Well, what do others see in us? Do people see in us what we do? They can hear our words, they can hear what it is that we say, but are we living that out? Does our example bear that out? Is it just lip service, or are we actually doing it? What is our character like? Because our children are going to see that, and the little ones, they're going to see that. They're going to see whether or not we're sincere in what it is that we're doing, or if we're just checking off a box. They're going to notice those things. Are we genuine? Because we can say the right things all day long, but our actions speak louder than our words. Here's Naomi, and she's saying, don't come with me. Don't follow me. Go back home to your mother's house. Go find yourself another husband. Go back to your gods here in Moab. But Ruth has seen something in her actions that speaks so much louder than her words in that moment that she says, no, I don't want that. I'm going to go where you go, and I'm going to live where you live, and I'm going to die where you die. Naomi led Ruth to God by her actions. Who are we leading by our actions? Where are we leading them by our actions? Who is it that we are bringing with us? Even though Naomi told them not to come, notice in verse 18, after Naomi sees that Ruth is determined to come with her, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now, it's not that Naomi's given her the silent treatment, right? It's not that Naomi, well, I'm not going to talk to you anymore because you're following me and I don't want you following me. She's not going to talk to her anymore about this particular matter. She's no longer going to try to convince Ruth to go back home. She sees Ruth as resolved and determined that she's going to go with Naomi back to the promised land. And so she's not going to speak of this anymore. Naomi was a mother to follow. Went to a gospel meeting one time. Phil Sanders was holding it. I don't remember exactly where it was. It was a long time ago. He was holding a gospel meeting, and during one of his lessons, he told a story in the introduction about a family. They were very poor. They lived above a storefront. They lived upstairs, and they made their living by cleaning the store out after hours, and that was what they did. And so as they were cleaning the store out after hours, there was a woman who was in the church. She saw this poor family that was there cleaning the store out, and she brought them some food, asked them if they'd be interested in knowing the gospel, asked them if they'd be interested in studying the Bible together. And it turns out that they were, and because that one woman took them some food and asked them if they wanted to study the Bible, that they studied the Bible and they became Christians. And so it was a whole family. It was mother and father, and it was little boys and girls that were in the family. And he told that story in the introduction. He didn't tell the rest of the story until he got over to the conclusion. But when you get to the conclusion of the story, one of those little boys that was in that family was Phil Sanders' grandfather. And that was why Phil Sanders and his family were in the church, was because one woman in the church took them some food and offered to study the gospel with them. And you don't see it in that particular moment when it's just that one little thing that you're doing. You don't see the impact. And she didn't live long enough, I reckon, to see the impact of all of that, because it's a young boy who's going to be the grandfather of Phil Sanders. But Phil Sanders, through his In Search of the Lord's Way program and all the different work that he's done, all the different souls that he's touched, all the different conversions that he's been responsible for, it all started with that one woman who took them some food and studied the gospel with them, all because of a sweet lady. Naomi led Ruth by her actions. And what if? What if she hadn't? What if Naomi hadn't had that kind of character? What if Naomi hadn't been that kind of person? What if Naomi didn't have that kind of influence over Ruth? You know, Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. She's in there. Later on, Ruth and Boaz beget Obed, and Obed begets Jesse, and Jesse begets David the king. Ruth is David's great-grandmother. What if Naomi hadn't done that? So let us think about how we got to where it is that we are. Why are we here? How did we get here? Likely we got here because somebody shared the gospel message with us, whether it was a coworker, whether it was a spouse, whether it was whoever it was. Somebody took the time to share the gospel with us. Where are we going? Are we going to the promised land that's waiting for us? You know, our number one goal in this life ought to be to get to heaven. And our number two goal ought to be to take as many people with us as we can. Who are we leading? Who are we taking with us? If you're here today and you're not on that path that leads to God's promised land, you can fix that. If you've heard the gospel message, if you know it to be true, if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you can confess him before others as Jesus told us to do in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 32. You can pledge allegiance to him, make him your Lord and Master. You can repent and be baptized for the remission of your sins. That's what Peter said we need to do in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38. Maybe you've done that, but you've not been walking that path, and you need to come home. You need to come back to the land that God has promised us. You need to come back to be a better influence on those that are around you. We can help you with that. We'll pray with you. We'll pray for you. If you have a need at any time, we invite you to respond to the Lord's invitation as we stand with Mark and as we sing.